I knew the HOA in this neighborhood was bad, but I never thought they'd resort to assault. That was before they tasered my sister in the middle of her own driveway. It all started 3 weeks ago when my sister Julia got a letter from the HOA. They claimed she had overdue fines totaling $2,000. The problem? She had already paid them 6 months ago. She even had the receipts. I live just 2 streets over, so when she called me, frustrated and fuming, I drove over to her place. Julia wasn't just mad, she was ready to go to war. And considering she was one of the most feared attorneys in the city, the HOA had no idea who they were messing with. "Harold, they're trying to extort me," she said, waving the letter in my face. "I paid this already, they just want more money." I sighed, rubbing my temples. "Have you talked to them?" "Oh, I talked to them," she said, her voice dripping with venom. "That witch Marlene, the HOA president, said their records show I never paid. And get this, she told me if I don't pay by Friday, they'll start foreclosure proceedings." I nearly choked. They're threatening foreclosure over fake fines. Exactly, Julia folded her arms. "So I filed an injunction this morning. If they try any legal action, they'll be in court faster than they can blink." I grinned. "You're going to bury them in paperwork." "Damn right." But Marlene and her HOA lackeys weren't going to make things that easy. That very night, Julia's security cameras caught 2 HOA board members sneaking onto her property and sticking a bright orange violation notice on her door. The notice claimed she was intentionally obstructing HOA enforcement and warned of further action. Julia laughed when she saw the footage. "They're desperate." Desperate wasn't the word for it. The next day, Marlene showed up in person, flanked by 2 HOA security guards. These weren't rent-a-cop mall security guys, they looked like they took their jobs way too seriously. Black boots, utility belts, and a taser on each hip. Julia met them on her front porch, arms crossed. I stood behind her, watching. "Miss Caldwell," Marlene said, her voice dripping with fake politeness, "you have an outstanding balance with the HOA." "No, I don't," Julia said flatly. "I already paid, I sent you proof, you ignored it." Marlene's lips curled into a smug little grin. "Our records disagree, and since you're refusing to comply, I'm afraid we'll have to escalate things." The 2 HOA security guards stepped forward. Julia didn't flinch. "Escalate? What does that mean, Marlene? You going to throw me in HOA jail?" Marlene's expression hardened. "We're here to enforce the rules. If you won't pay, we'll have to take action." That's when one of the guards reached for Julia's arm. She yanked it back. "Touch me and I swear I'll..." Greg. The taser hit her square in the side. I didn't even process what happened at first. 1 second, Julia was standing tall, and the next, she was crumpling to the ground, convulsing. Marlene gasped, pretending to be shocked. "Oh my, that was entirely unnecessary, but you did resist." I saw red. I lunged at the guard who tased her, but the other one shoved me back. Julia groaned, trying to push herself up, her body still shaking from the voltage. "You just assaulted a lawyer," I growled. "A damn good one." Marlene sniffed. "She resisted enforcement. We have the right to use force when necessary." I knelt beside Julia, helping her up. Her hands were shaking, but her eyes were burning with fury. "Oh, you idiots," she muttered, voice ragged. "You have no idea what you just did." Marlene just smirked. "If you don't pay by Friday, expect another visit." Then they walked off, leaving us standing in the driveway. I turned to Julia. "Are you okay?" She winced, rubbing her side. "I will be, but Marlene, she's done." I believed her, because when Julia set her sights on someone, she never lost. And this time, she wasn't just fighting a fine. She was out for blood. Julia didn't waste a second. The moment she steadied herself, she was already pulling out her phone, her fingers moving with precision as she dialed a number. I had seen her in action before, but this was different. This wasn't just another case, this was personal. She spoke in clipped, controlled sentences, her voice carrying a razor-sharp edge. Whoever was on the other end didn't interrupt. When she hung up, she turned to me, her expression unreadable. "That was the police, they're on their way," she said. "And I also called my firm. Marlene and her goons just made the worst mistake of their lives." I nodded. "Good, because what they did back there, that was criminal." Julia didn't reply right away. She took a deep breath, rolling her shoulders as if shaking off the lingering effects of the taser. It didn't matter how tough she was. Getting hit with that amount of voltage wasn't something you just walked off, but she wasn't about to let them see weakness. Minutes later, the sound of sirens filled the air. A patrol car pulled up in front of her house and 2 officers stepped out. One was an older man with a no-nonsense expression, and the other was younger. his eyes scanning the area with quiet curiosity. Julia met them halfway, her tone shifting into something that was both authoritative and professional. She laid out exactly what had happened, describing the assault in clinical detail. The officers exchanged glances when she mentioned the taser. That wasn't something they could ignore. "You have security footage?" the older officer asked. "Yes, and I'll be providing my attorney with a copy," Julia said. That seemed to seal it. The officers didn't waste time. They immediately made their way to Marlene's house, which wasn't far from Julia's. I followed, watching as they knocked on the door. It took a while, but eventually Marlene opened it, her expression shifting the moment she saw the officers. She put on an air of forced politeness, but I could see the stiffness in her posture. "Officers, what seems to be the problem?" she asked, feigning innocence. The older officer didn't play along. "We've received a report that you and your security personnel used excessive force on a resident. We need to speak with you and your security team immediately." Marlene's expression flickered, but she quickly masked it. "Excessive force, that's a serious accusation." "It is," Julia cut in. She had followed us, standing just behind the officers, "and it's also on camera." That knocked the fake politeness right off Marlene's face. "You had no right to interfere with HOA enforcement," she snapped. The younger officer frowned. "HOA enforcement does not involve assaulting homeowners with a taser." Marlene's face twitched. She resisted. "My security acted within their rights." The older officer's eyes hardened. "Your security is not law enforcement. They had no legal right to use force against a resident, especially on private property." At that moment, one of the security guards appeared at the door, the same one who had used the taser on Julia. He looked uneasy, as if he was realizing just how deep he was in. The older officer turned to him. "Did you deploy your taser on Miss Caldwell?" The guard hesitated. "She was interfering with HOA business," he said, his voice lacking confidence. "That's not an answer," the officer said sharply. "Did you use your taser on her?" There was a long silence. Then, reluctantly, the guard nodded. "Turn around," the officer ordered. The guard's face went pale. "Wait, what? You can't. You just admitted to using excessive force on a homeowner who posed no threat. You're under arrest." Marlene's mouth opened and closed, her face contorted with disbelief. "This is outrageous." The younger officer pulled out his handcuffs, securing the guard's wrists as the older officer turned back to Marlene. "We'll be launching a full investigation. If we find that you ordered or encouraged this level of force, you'll be facing serious charges." Marlene's confidence wavered. "I was simply enforcing the HOA's guidelines." "Your guidelines do not override the law," Julia said, her voice carrying lethal precision. "And you, Marlene, just opened yourself up to a civil lawsuit. Hope you have a good lawyer." Marlene's face lost all color. The officers took the guard into custody, leaving Marlene standing frozen at her doorstep. She had just realized that she had lost control of the situation, and there was nothing she hated more. Julia turned to me, her eyes gleaming with satisfaction. "This is just the beginning," she murmured. I believed her, because when Julia decided to take someone down, she never stopped until they were utterly destroyed. The moment the HOA's security guard was hauled away in cuffs, word spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Within an hour, people were stepping outside, whispering in hushed voices, peeking through curtains, and exchanging knowing glances. Marlene had ruled with an iron fist for years, but now, for the first time, she looked shaken. Julia, on the other hand, was just getting started. By the time we got back to her house, she was already making calls. She spoke to her firm's investigators, ensuring they gathered every piece of evidence available. The security footage was already backed up, and Julia directed them to pull any past HOA violations against other homeowners. She wanted to see if there was a pattern of intimidation. I watched her work, impressed as always. She wasn't just planning a response, she was dismantling the entire HOA's structure, brick by brick. When she finally set her phone down, she exhaled sharply. "They've been doing this for years," she said, her voice carrying a newfound edge. "I just spoke to 3 people on this street who have had fines appear out of nowhere. Some of them paid just to avoid trouble, but a few tried to fight back and got harassed for it." I wasn't surprised. Marlene had always acted like she owned this neighborhood, but most people didn't have the time or resources to challenge her. Julia, however, was a different beast entirely. She leaned back against the kitchen counter, rolling her shoulders as if preparing for battle. "They're not just crooked," she continued. They're running a racket, and if I can prove that those fines were deliberately falsified, that's fraud. I grinned, and fraud means prison time. Julia's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. Exactly. A sharp knock at the door interrupted us. I moved instinctively, stepping ahead of Julia as she walked toward it, but she gave me a look that said she could handle herself. When she opened the door, Marlene was standing there, her expression carefully neutral. But something in her eyes flickered an unease she was trying desperately to hide. Julia didn't invite her in. She simply stood there, arms crossed, waiting. Marlene cleared her throat. I think we need to have a conversation. Julia tilted her head slightly. About your security guard getting arrested, or about the fraudulent fines? Marlene's lips pressed together. About the misunderstanding. Julia let out a short, humorless laugh. There was no misunderstanding. Your thug tased me in my own driveway, and you stood there and justified it. Now, unless you're here to hand over every financial record for the last 5 years, I don't see why we need to talk. Marlene's nostrils flared. There's no reason this has to turn into a legal battle. Julia's expression didn't waver. Oh, but there is. See, when you tried to extort me, that was bad enough. When you sent goons to intimidate me, you made it worse. But the second you resorted to violence, you turned this into my personal project. Marlene's composure cracked just for a second. You think you can take down the entire HOA? Julia's voice was deadly calm. I know I can. Marlene took a slow breath, as if forcing herself to stay composed. The board won't back you. They've stood by me for years. Julia's eyes gleamed. Then they can go down with you. Marlene hesitated, and I saw that sliver of doubt creeping in. For the first time, she was realizing that this wasn't going away. Finally, she stepped back, her voice tight. You're making a mistake. Julia didn't blink. No, you did. Marlene turned and walked off, her posture stiff, her movements sharp with frustration. As soon as she was gone, Julia shut the door and exhaled slowly. She's scared, I said. Julia nodded. She should be. The next morning, things escalated. Julia woke up to find a new violation notice taped to her door. This one claimed she had failed to maintain her property to HOA standards and threatened daily fines until she complied. She didn't even look surprised. She simply pulled out her phone, snapped a picture, and sent it to her legal team. Desperation, she muttered. They're trying to bury me in nonsense violations. But she wasn't the only one. By noon, several neighbors had come forward, each with similar stories. New fines, sudden warnings, all of them targeting people who had spoken out against the HOA in the past. Julia, of course, saw this for exactly what it was. They're trying to scare people into silence, she told me, but they just gave me more evidence of retaliation. That night, Julia held a meeting at her house. Word had spread fast, and nearly 24 neighbors showed up, many of them angry, others nervous. The air buzzed with frustration as Julia laid everything out for them: the fraudulent fines, the intimidation tactics, the outright abuse of power. And then she made her move. We have grounds for a lawsuit, she announced. A class action. If we work together, we can take them down for good, but I need people willing to step up. For a moment, silence stretched across the room. Then one by one, hands started rising. By the end of the night, Julia had a list of plaintiffs, sworn statements, and a plan. The HOA had spent years using fear to control this neighborhood. But they had never gone up against someone like Julia. And they were about to regret every single decision that led them to this moment. As soon as Julia solidified the class action lawsuit, things in the neighborhood shifted overnight. The air was thick with tension, like a storm about to break. People who had once cowered under the HOA's rule now walked a little taller, emboldened by the fact that someone was finally standing up to them. But Marlene wasn't about to go down quietly. The very next morning, Julia woke up to find a tow truck idling in her driveway, its driver already hooking up to her car. She stormed outside, barefoot and furious, demanding to know what was going on. The driver, a lanky man with tired eyes, hesitated before answering. He gestured toward a clipboard, where an official-looking document bore the HOA's letterhead. It claimed Julia's vehicle was abandoned and in violation of community parking rules. Julia didn't waste a second. She snatched the clipboard, glanced over it, and then turned her attention to the driver. Her voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable edge to it. The driver shifted awkwardly, clearly realizing he had just been caught in the middle of something far bigger than a routine tow job. He hesitated for a moment before stepping away from the truck, muttering something under his breath as he unhooked her car. She didn't even bother looking at him. Her focus was on the document in her hands. By the time she returned inside, she was already making calls. The fraudulent fines were one thing, but now Marlene was actively trying to interfere with her ability to function. Julia wasn't going to let that stand. She spent the next several hours compiling evidence, timestamps from her security system proving that her car hadn't moved from the driveway, previous communications from the HOA, and a copy of the community's official parking regulations. The more she gathered, the clearer it became that the HOA was scrambling, grasping at straws in a desperate attempt to make her back down. That evening she called another meeting. More neighbors showed up this time, their frustration mounting with every new violation and threat they received. Some had received sudden increases in their monthly HOA dues, while others had found letters taped to their doors warning them of pending legal action if they continued to associate with Julia. She listened carefully, taking notes, and when everyone had spoken, she laid out the next step. If Marlene thought she could intimidate them into submission, she was wrong. Over the next few days, Julia worked tirelessly, filing motion after motion, dragging the HOA into legal proceedings they weren't prepared for. She subpoenaed financial records, exposing discrepancies in the way funds had been handled. She tracked down former board members, some of whom had been forced out under dubious circumstances, and gathered their testimonies. Then she set her sights on the most damning piece of evidence, the HOA's financial books. Through a contact at her firm, she managed to get her hands on an independent audit of the HOA's expenditures. What she found was worse than she had imagined. The HOA had been siphoning money for years, diverting funds meant for maintenance and repairs into miscellaneous expenses that had no clear documentation. Thousands of dollars had vanished, funneled into personal accounts tied to Marlene and her closest board members. It was embezzlement, plain and simple. Julia wasted no time. She compiled everything into a detailed report and sent it straight to the state attorney's office. The fallout was immediate. Within 48 hours, investigators descended upon the HOA's office, demanding records and freezing accounts. Marlene was nowhere to be seen, but the rest of the board scrambled to distance themselves, claiming ignorance. But ignorance wasn't a defense. As the legal proceedings intensified, Marlene finally resurfaced, this time with an attorney of her own. She tried to spin the narrative, claiming that Julia was orchestrating a personal vendetta against her. She even went as far as calling a community meeting, attempting to rally support. It backfired spectacularly. The residents, now fully aware of just how badly they had been deceived, turned on her in an instant. People stood up, shouting over her rehearsed speech, demanding answers. Some waved copies of the fraudulent fines they had been forced to pay, while others listed off repairs that had never been completed despite the HOA collecting fees for them. Marlene's face paled as the reality sank in. She had lost them. A week later, the official charges were filed. Marlene and 2 other board members were arrested on charges of fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. The HOA was placed under external review, its authority stripped while the investigation continued. Julia, however, wasn't done. With the board dismantled, she led the charge to reform the HOA from the ground up. New leadership was elected, consisting of homeowners who had suffered under Marlene's rule. Policies were rewritten, ensuring that no future board could wield unchecked power. By the end of it all, the neighborhood was unrecognizable. The fear that had once gripped it was gone, replaced by something far more powerful: unity. And as for Julia, she didn't just win. She made sure they would never forget the price of crossing her. With Marlene and the corrupt board members facing criminal charges, the neighborhood buzzed with a sense of liberation that hadn't been felt in years. People who had once kept their heads down now walked with a sense of purpose, their conversations no longer filled with whispered complaints, but with hopeful discussions about what came next. Julia, however, wasn't celebrating just yet. She knew that while the HOA's previous reign had collapsed, there was still unfinished business. The legal proceedings against Marlene and her cohorts had only just begun, and Julia intended to make sure they paid for every ounce of misery they had inflicted. She spent the next several days coordinating with attorneys, city officials, and forensic accountants who were combing through years of financial records. Every missing dollar, every fraudulent fine, every bogus expense was being cataloged and prepared for trial. The evidence was overwhelming, and Julia's reputation as a relentless litigator meant that the prosecution had all the firepower they needed. But while the legal battle raged on, there was another issue that needed to be resolved: the HOA itself. With Marlene gone and the HOA under external review, the neighborhood had an opportunity to rebuild from the ground up. A temporary committee had been formed, made up of residents who had suffered under the previous regime, and they were tasked with deciding what the future of the association would look like. Julia attended the first official meeting, but not as an attorney. This time, she was just a homeowner who wanted to make sure history didn't repeat itself. The meeting was held in the community center, a building that had fallen into disrepair under Marlene's neglect. The walls were scuffed, the ceiling lights flickered intermittently, and the chairs were mismatched, a clear indication of how little of the HOA's funds had actually been used for maintenance. Dozens of residents filled the space, each of them eager to voice their thoughts. Some wanted to dissolve the HOA entirely, arguing that it had been nothing but a tool for corruption. Others believed that it could be salvaged with the right leadership and strict oversight. Julia listened carefully before finally standing to speak. She pointed out that while the HOA had been weaponized against homeowners in the past, it could also be a force for good if properly restructured. Without it, there would be no oversight to prevent another power-hungry opportunist from exploiting the community. The key was ensuring that no single person or small group could consolidate control like Marlene had. Her words carried weight. People trusted her after everything she had done to bring the corrupt board down. By the end of the meeting, a decision had been reached. The HOA would remain, but with a radically different structure. The new bylaws would include term limits for board members, mandatory financial transparency, and a system for residents to challenge fines before they were enforced. The days of unchecked power were officially over. As the meeting ended, Julia stepped outside, taking a deep breath. For the first time in weeks, she felt like things were finally moving in the right direction. But there was still one last piece of unfinished business. Marlene had yet to face trial, and Julia wanted to make sure that when she did, there would be no chance for her to slip through the cracks. The next morning, Julia met with the lead prosecutor assigned to the case. They went over the charges in detail, ensuring that every aspect of Marlene's scheme was accounted for. The fraudulent fines, the embezzlement, the illegal enforcement tactics, it was all laid out in a devastating case that left no room for misinterpretation. The prosecutor assured Julia that they intended to pursue the maximum penalties available. Given the sheer volume of evidence, a plea deal was unlikely. Marlene was looking at years behind bars. But Julia wasn't satisfied with just sending Marlene to prison. She wanted full restitution for the homeowners who had been scammed out of their money. She pushed for a civil lawsuit on behalf of the affected residents, ensuring that every stolen dollar would be returned. The legal process would take time, but Julia had already proven she had the patience and determination to see it through. As the weeks passed, the community continued to heal. The temporary HOA committee worked tirelessly to implement the new rules, and for the first time in years, homeowners felt like they actually had a say in how their neighborhood was run. Then the trial date was set. Marlene, once the untouchable queen of the HOA, now stood in a courtroom, facing a judge and a jury. The prosecution laid out the case with brutal precision, showcasing the evidence Julia had painstakingly gathered. Witness after witness testified, homeowners recounting the harassment, the fraudulent fines, the threats. Marlene's attorney tried to paint her as a misunderstood leader, claiming she had only been enforcing the rules. But the evidence was undeniable. The financial records alone were enough to seal her fate. When the verdict was finally read, there was no surprise. Guilty. Marlene was sentenced to prison, her empire of fear dismantled beyond repair. But for Julia, the true victory wasn't just in seeing Marlene behind bars. It was in watching the neighborhood thrive in her absence. The community had come together, stronger than ever. The HOA, once a tool of oppression, was now a fair and transparent organization that actually served the residents. Fines were reasonable, enforcement was handled with fairness, and no one lived in fear of sudden retaliation. Julia had set out to fight a personal battle, but in the end, she had won something far greater. She had given the neighborhood back to the people who called it home. With Marlene convicted and the corrupt HOA board dismantled, the neighborhood finally had a chance to breathe. The dark cloud of harassment and intimidation had lifted, and people began reclaiming their lives without the constant fear of unjust fines or retaliatory actions. But Julia wasn't done yet. While the trial had put Marlene and her cronies behind bars, there was still the matter of restitution. The fraudulent fines and misappropriated HOA fees had left many residents financially strained, and Julia was determined to ensure they got their money back. The civil lawsuit she had filed on behalf of the homeowners was moving forward, and she was relentless in her pursuit of every stolen dollar. The new HOA leadership, made up of honest, well-intentioned homeowners, had fully cooperated with the investigation. They had opened up the financial records, provided testimonies, and worked closely with the auditors to track down missing funds. Through their efforts, it became clear that Marlene had funneled a significant portion of the embezzled money into various shell accounts, some of which were still active. Julia wasted no time. She pushed for an asset freeze, preventing Marlene from hiding or transferring any remaining funds. Then she tracked down properties and valuables purchased with stolen money, ensuring they would be liquidated and returned to the rightful owners. The legal battle was intense, but Julia thrived in the pressure. Every day she uncovered new layers of deception Marlene had orchestrated over the years. The fraudulent fines were only the tip of the iceberg. HOA funds had been used to pay for luxury vacations, private club memberships, and even personal renovations to Marlene's home. It was a deep, tangled mess of corruption, but Julia was untangling it one thread at a time. Meanwhile, the neighborhood was undergoing a transformation. With the oppressive rule of the previous HOA gone, people started investing in their homes again, no longer afraid that arbitrary rules would penalize them for minor aesthetic choices. The community center, once neglected, was finally receiving much-needed repairs. Volunteers worked together to restore the landscaping, repaint the buildings, and revitalize the park areas. Julia had never intended to become the face of the neighborhood's revolution, but her relentless fight for justice had inspired people. She had proven that no one was untouchable, no matter how much power they thought they wielded. As the weeks passed, the lawsuit gained traction. The court ruled in favor of the homeowners, ordering full restitution of the stolen funds. Marlene, now sitting behind bars, was left with nothing. Her personal assets were seized, her accounts drained, and her influence completely eradicated. Julia had won not just for herself, but for everyone who had suffered under Marlene's rule. With the legal battles finally reaching their conclusion, Julia took a step back. She had done what she set out to do, and now it was time for the neighborhood to move forward without her constantly being on the front lines. The new HOA leadership was competent and transparent, and with the new bylaws in place, there was little chance of another Marlene rising to power. One evening, as she sat on her porch watching the sunset, she reflected on everything that had happened. She had never wanted a fight, but when the HOA had forced her hand, she had given them one they couldn't win. Now the community was stronger, more united, and free from the corruption that had plagued it for years. And for the first time in a long time, Julia could finally relax, knowing that justice had been served.